Allama Iqbal's words were a powerful source of guidance when Pakistan came into existence. In 1947, and during its early years, every morning Radio Pakistan broadcast his prayer for children that began, "My wish comes to my lips as supplication. May my life be like a lighted candle, O God." Iqbal's words left a permanent imprint on the minds of the children who heard it. However, over time, this prayer ceased to be broadcast, and today there are very few children who are familiar with it. Though Iqbal lived in a historical context that was different from ours in several ways, what he said remains profoundly relevant to us and to our times. In fact, Iqbal's message is more relevant and important today than that of any other Muslim thinker of the past and present, not only because he faced the challenges of both traditionalism and modernity fearlessly, but also, and more importantly, because he had a profound understanding of the integrated vision of the Quran, which he made the basis of his philosophy. This philosophy provides a comprehensive blueprint for how Muslims should live in accordance with the highest ideals and best practices of Islam. Its aim is to change ground realities in the light of the ethical principles of Islam. These realities change with time, but the framework remains constant and continues to be a central point of reference and a guidepost for future generations. The place that Iqbal occupies in the hearts and minds of Pakistanis is unparalleled, as is his poetry. Even though few people appreciate the range and depth of his knowledge and creativity or his philosophical system, such are the power and charisma of his imagination and his pen, that he is loved by millions who might know only a few of his verses, but are inspired and moved by them. Without doubt, Iqbal is the most quoted figure in Pakistan, and his popular verses and favorite symbols, such as that of the Shaheen, are known even to semi-literate Pakistanis. However, his philosophy, articulated through both poetry and prose, which should be taught in every educational institution in Pakistan, has been virtually eliminated from the curriculum, and only a small number of students in specialized disciplines have the opportunity to study it. While some famous verses from Iqbal's poems are often cited in isolation, the core message of his poetry, reflecting his revolutionary spirit, his intrepid imagination, and his passionate commitment to justice and the dignity of selfhood, has been excluded from public discourse. Iqbal constantly referred to the Quranic verse, "Verily, God will not change the condition of a people till they change what is in themselves," Quran 13:12. He was fully aware of the despair and despondency of Muslims who felt powerless to change their adverse circumstances and turned to prayer for an improvement in their lives. Iqbal had written much about the value of prayer, but he believed that the way to change one's destiny was through the development of khudi. Iqbal's philosophy, rich as it is in ideas and concepts, is fundamentally action-oriented, and its goal was personal and social transformation, inspired by the Quranic vision, embodied in the proclamation, "Toward God is your limit," Quran 53:42. Today, when Pakistani youth are living in a society in which there is a gaping ethical vacuum, they are in critical need of a deep and comprehensive education based upon Iqbal's multifaceted philosophy. Iqbal's work can be a source of profound guidance to help young Pakistanis as they seek to understand the nature of their own identity and their own religion. His powerful words challenge them to become a Shaheen, which hunts for its food rather than a vulture, which preys on the dead. The flight of both birds is in the same atmosphere, but the world of the vulture is different from the world of the Shaheen. To comprehend why Iqbal has suffered such amazing neglect by the country that at the same time hails him as its spiritual founder, one has to understand the moral, intellectual, social, and political degeneration that has sadly characterized most of Pakistan's history. Largely dominated by feudal and other powerful persons and groups with vested interests, Pakistani society has had very limited opportunity to think or act freely, subjected to long periods of authoritarian rule. Its spirit has languished and has lost the will to resist coercion and suppression. Iqbal, the undaunted thinker who urged the oppressed masses to revolt against all forms of totalitarianism, religious, political, cultural, intellectual, economic, or any other, was the vital force that was needed to free the Indian Muslims from their internal shackles and external bondage. But his words, his voice, his message constituted a grave threat to those power wielders in Pakistan who wanted to keep the people subservient so that they would not challenge them or claim their own rights. To ensure the fulfillment of their purposes, they had to silence Iqbal's anti-authoritarian voice as much as possible. The relegation of Iqbal's vision and message to obscurity was, therefore, not by accident but by design, orphaned by its two founding fathers, Iqbal and Jinnah, at such an early age, and neglected or plundered by successive leaders. Pakistan must turn to Iqbal's writings to reconstruct its intellectual and ethical foundation, such as his advice to the youth about the qualities needed to become a leader. Reader knew the lesson of truthfulness, justice, and bravery. To you will be given the task of leading the world. I quote this verse to the youth of Tehreek-e-Insaf because truth, bravery, and justice are among the most highly valued attributes of a human being. We need to understand Iqbal's commitment to social justice and the pain he felt when he looked at the plight of the world's indigent workers. His memorable verse addressed to God, in which he points out the discrepancy between the justice of God and the unjust plight of those who labored hard for a meager living, is meant in fact to jolt the conscience of those rich people who exploit the ones who labor for them. You are almighty and just, but in your world, intensely bitter is the life of the poor laborers. It is difficult to find a poet or thinker of Iqbal's caliber who has championed the cause of justice for the oppressed and wronged people of the world as passionately and consistently as he did. If we follow Iqbal's teaching, we can reverse the growing gap between the westernized, rich, and traditional poor. That helps fuel fundamentalism. The best weapon against fundamentalism is enlightened Islam. Fanatics on both sides of the argument need to be told about Islamic history, how other religions and other points of view were tolerated by Islam in the days when Europe was ruled by bigotry and ignorance. During what was known as the Golden Age of Islam, from around the mid-8th to the mid-13th century, the Muslim world, which stretched from Iberia and North Africa across to Southwest and Central Asia, was known for its spirit of intellectual discovery and religious tolerance. Islam never knew the savagery of the Inquisition. The set of legal principles stated or implied in the Quran has a great capacity for expansion and development. As frequently pointed out by Iqbal, as early as the 9th century AD, Muslim scholars were debating the rights of the child. The sophistication of this debate was such that a scholar, before putting forth his point of view, would start by saying, "It is possible that I may be wrong." This spirit of openness was to be expected, since freedom of thought is guaranteed by Islam. The Prophet's conflict with the Meccans was over the right to express his opinion. When the state of Medina was formed, freedom of speech was considered every citizen's right. The Prophet once said that a difference of opinion in his community was a sign of Allah's grace. It was this freedom of thought and the spirit of inquiry which created the intellectual atmosphere that led to the blossoming of the Muslim civilization. For hundreds of years, all top scientists were Muslims, dominating the fields of logic, metaphysics, chemistry, algebra, astronomy, and medicine. Until the advent of Islam, scientific knowledge amongst the Arabs had been stagnant for centuries. By the 8th century, medical and philosophical texts were translated into Arabic, allowing the Arabs to build on the wisdom of the past and make vast leaps forward in science. Islamic scholars had a profound effect on European thought centuries later. By the 10th century, everything worth translating from ancient Greek works was available in Arabic. It was also during this period of cultural flowering that Muslim merchants developed modern commercial instruments such as checks, letters of credit, and joint stock companies. Ibn Sina, 980 to 1027. Ibn Rashid, 1126 to 98, and Al-Ghazali died 1111 were amongst the Islamic philosophers who had a huge impact on European thought. Roger Bacon. Bacon, one of the greatest names in Western science. Considered Ibn Sina, the prince and leader of philosophy. Bacon learned from Arab thinkers about experimental science and Aristotelian philosophy. He was also a great transmitter of Arab knowledge into the mainstream of European thought. By the end of the 11th century, Latin translations of Arabic works on science began to filter into Europe, mainly from Muslim, Spain, Iraq, and Sicily. Among the centers of European learning that helped diffuse Islamic knowledge throughout the European world was the Arabist school at Montpellier in the south of France. From Montpellier, scholars spread in all directions across Europe. The philosopher Al-Ghazali's work had great influence on both Islamic and European scholars. His development of Greek philosophies, especially Aristotle's, influenced European philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi. In turn, it was the work of Aquinas that helped spark off the spirit of inquiry in Europe that would later lead to the Reformation. According to the historian W. Montgomery Watt, when one becomes aware of the full extent of Arab experimenting, Arab thinking, and Arab writing, one sees that without the Arabs, European science and philosophy would not have developed when they did. The Arabs were no mere transmitters of Greek thought, but genuine bearers, who both kept alive the disciplines they had been taught and extended their range. When about the year 1100, Europeans became seriously interested in the science and philosophy of their Saracen enemies. These disciplines were at their zenith, and the Europeans had to learn all they could from the Arabs before they themselves could make further advances. The quest for knowledge was reflected in the libraries that existed in the Islamic cities of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba. In 1171, when the legendary warrior Salahuddin entered Baghdad, the public library had 150 volumes. In Cordoba, Al-Hakim's library had between 400 and 600 volumes. At this period in history, the universities in Europe had hardly any access to books. In his book, The Rise of Humanism in Classical Islam and the Christian West, the Arabist and Islamicist George Makdisi traces the origins of humanism, the modern system of knowledge imparted in Western universities, and to the early Islamic era. He writes about how from the 8th century onwards, there was an environment of learning in Arab colleges, madrasas, and the courts of Iraq, Sicily, Egypt, and Andalusia, where disputation, dissent, and argument were the order of the day. By the end of the 11th century, most Muslim cities had universities. The decay and decline in Islamic intellectual thought, according to Iqbal, is that set in 500 years ago, when the doors to ijtihad, a scholarly debate on our religion and its traditions, were closed. The Quranic principles, which for Muslims are eternal principles, needed constantly to be reinterpreted in light of new knowledge. In his lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, Iqbal cites 3 reasons for this stagnation. First, around the 10th century, there was controversy between 2 schools of thought, one rationalist and one conservative, about issues such as the eternity of the Quran, the ruling Islamic dynasty of the time, the Abbasids, threw their weight behind the conservatives, fearing that unrestrained adherence to a particular type of rationalism could endanger the stability of Islam as a social polity. The second reason was the rise of ascetic Sufism, which grew partly in reaction to the increasing conservatism of the Islamic establishment. The Sufis, the mystics of Sunni Islam, wanted to focus more on inner spirituality rather than a rigidly guarded set of rules. But according to Iqbal, their concentration on otherworldliness ignored Islam's role as a means of organizing society and politics. He complained that ascetic Sufism ended up attracting and finally absorbing the best minds in Islam. The Muslim state was thus left generally in the hands of intellectual mediocrities and of the unthinking masses of Islam, who found their security only in blindly following the schools of the great Islamic jurists such as Abu Hanifa and Malik ibn Anas, Iqbal, pointing to the Quran's emphasis on deed, believed it was contrary to the true spirit of Islam to turn away from the real world, as some Sufis did. He felt that becoming a hermit or ascetic meant avoiding the joy and struggle of real life. To those who taught Islam, he said, to teach religion in the world, if this be your aim, do not teach your nation that it should withdraw from the world. The third and probably most decisive factor was the Mongols' destruction in 1258 of Baghdad, the center of Muslim intellectual life. Had the Mongol hordes not taken over swathes of the Muslim world, our history might have been very different. This legendary tribe from Mongolia laid waste to cities and decimated populations across Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. Their merciless sacking of Baghdad, which had at one point been the center of wealth, commerce, and learning of the Islamic world, has historically been seen as the death blow for the golden age of Islam, with the destruction of its famous libraries. Centuries of learning were lost, and this huge cultural trauma inevitably led to greater conservatism as Muslims feared the eradication of their civilization. Although the Mongols had, by the early 14th century, converted to Islam, their autocratic rule clamped down on the capacity of the ulama, Muslim legal scholars, for independent judgment. The gates to ijtihad were declared closed, unity became key, dissension discouraged, and foreigners became suspect. In the 18th and 19th century, when Indian Muslims, like us, were confronted with serious external and internal impediments, the rallying cry of the modernist reformers, from Sayyid Ahmad Khan to Iqbal, was back to the Quran. Forward with ijtihad. Back to the Quran meant the rediscovery of the fundamental teachings and principles of the Quran. And forward with ijtihad meant the mental effort made to form an independent judgment on a legal point so that normative Islamic principles could be applied in modern times. Iqbal was acutely conscious of the stagnation and decadence that had sapped the creative energy of Muslim societies. Therefore, while strongly advocating a return to the Quran, which he regarded as fundamental to Islam, Iqbal also sought to reinfuse the dynamism of original Islam through ijtihad, which he regarded as the principle of movement in the structure of Islam. According to Iqbal, such was the fear about the future of Islam that the conservative thinkers of Islam focused on preserving a uniform social life for the people by a jealous exclusion of all innovation in the laws of Sharia, as expounded by the early doctors of Islam. He believed that the ultimate fate of a people does not depend so much on organization as on the worth and power of individual men. In an over-organized society, the individual is altogether crushed out of existence. Iqbal felt that a man lost his soul under the weight of such conformism, and that a false reverence for past history and its artificial resurrection was no remedy for a people's decay. He maintained that the only power that counteracts the forces of decay was freedom of thought, the inner impulse of Islam, and that the only alternative given to us is to tear off from Islam the hard crust that has immobilized an essentially dynamic outlook on life, and to rediscover the original verities of freedom, equality, and solidarity, with a view to rebuild our moral, social, and political ideals out of their original simplicity and universality. In the context of ijtihad, Iqbal pointed out in his 6th lecture of his outstanding lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam that in the modern period things had changed, and the world of Islam is today confronted and affected by new forces set free by the extraordinary development of human thought in all its directions. He went on to make a statement that has an extraordinary significance and relevance for us. The claim of the present generation of Muslim liberals to reinterpret the foundational legal principles in the light of their own experience and altered conditions of modern life is, in my opinion, perfectly justified. The teaching of the Quran that life is a process of progressive creation necessitates that each generation, guided but unhampered by the work of its predecessors, should be permitted to solve its own problems. Iqbal once wrote that all search for knowledge is essentially a form of prayer, far from dismissing Western scientific advances. He believed we should study them and incorporate their positive content in our paradigm for a new country that would be informed by Islamic ideals as well as modern knowledge. Instead, we allowed Pakistan to stagnate, virtually since its inception. The westernized elite who took over from the departing British colonial rulers had little interest in seeking this fusion of Islamic ideals and scientific progress. Rather, they adopted a system that allowed them to perpetuate themselves in power, never allowing true democracy to flourish. Our reactionary mullahs promoted a medieval attitude to religion that grew ever more distorted as Islam was hijacked as a political tool. Iqbal had stressed the need to use ijtihad with a view to rebuild the law of Sharia in the light of modern thought and experience. He had pointed out that just as the European Renaissance and Reformation were inspired by the acquisition of knowledge from the Muslim universities of Spain and the Middle East during the Crusades, contemporary Muslims should use Western knowledge in their reconstruction of their own religious thought. Like Iqbal, the 19th century Egyptian scholar Muhammad Abdu also identified excessive conformism, which sadly exists in the majority of the Muslim world today as one of the causes of the decline of the Muslims. He felt that excessive adherence to the outward aspects of law led to a habit of blind imitation, which was far from the freedom of true Islam. And he linked the spread of taqlid to the rise of Turkish power. The Turks encouraged a slavish acceptance of authority and discouraged the free exercise of reason among those they ruled. Knowledge was their enemy, for it would teach their subjects how bad the ruler's conduct was. So they introduced their supporters into the ranks of the ulema to teach the faithful a dull stagnation in matters of belief and the acceptance of political autocracy. It was a succession of Turkish invaders from the northwest, the Ghaznavids, the Ghurids, the Timurids, and then the Mughals, who consolidated Islam in South Asia from the mid-10th century on. After the Turks came the British, whose rule also contributed to the spread of fundamentalism, stoking fears that Western culture was in danger of overwhelming the Islamic way of life. Just as 1,000 years ago, the Europeans were similarly threatened by the rise of Islam. Fundamentalism at its outset was a reaction to colonialism, particularly among the Muslims for whom religion and culture are intertwined. Muslim reaction to the competition posed by Western power, often seen as synonymous with the forces of modernity, has usually followed two patterns. One school of thought decides the Islamic world must beat the West at its own game, using Western tools to solve Eastern problems and confining Islam to the private sphere. Hence the Arab world's various stabs at nationalism and socialism in the 20th century in reaction to the spread of 19th century European colonialism. The other school recoils, calling for a retreat to time-honored traditions, a return to the simplicities of the original Muslim lifestyle in the desert, and an older, purer form of Islam stripped of the various cultural influences it has acquired in its dissemination. In British India, these two competing responses emerged after the 1857 uprising against British rule and the humiliation of the last Mughal emperor whom they deposed and exiled to Burma. William Dalrymple's The Last Mughal ends with the foundation of two very different educational establishments. One is Aligarh Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, a bid by the Anglophile Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to revive the fortunes of Muslim Indians through Western-style education. The other is a madrasa in Deoband that went on to propagate a narrow version of Islam that rejects all forms of Westernization and still to this day competes in South Asia with the Barelvi movement, whose teachings are more in line with Sufi Islam. Dalrymple points out that the Taliban emerged out of Deobandi madrasas in Pakistan and Afghanistan. As we have seen in our own time, nothing threatens the liberal and moderate aspect of Islam so much as aggressive Western intrusion and interference in the East, just as nothing so dramatically radicalizes the ordinary Muslim and feeds the power of the extremists. The histories of Islamic fundamentalism and Western imperialism have, after all, often been closely and dangerously intertwined. Today, we need to reclaim the vision and wisdom of the modernist reformers who paved the way for the creation of Pakistan. We need to do this because we badly need a cultural, intellectual, and moral renaissance in Pakistan, so that we are able to create societies and communities that are educated and enlightened, just and compassionate, forward-looking and life-affirming. We need to utilize our rational faculties and engage in scholarly discussion and reflection to find a solution to contemporary issues, such as the blending of the positive aspects of Western culture with Islam. The new Renaissance must also offer an alternative to the Western materialism and consumerism that has been totally imbibed by our ruling classes and which our country cannot afford. Iqbal and other modernist reformist thinkers had been deeply concerned about the reluctance of many Muslims to respond positively to Western culture. In particular, the rigidity of the mullahs whose mindset had been fossilized in medieval times. The combination of ruling oligarchies and a rigid religious mindset had stopped the forward movement of rational, academic, and scientific interaction with the changing world, which would have led to a dynamic Islamic culture. Unfortunately, this is why the concept of ijtihad is so absent, not just in Pakistan, but in the Muslim world at large. Democracy and freedom of speech have been stifled for decades. Moreover, education, research, and the quest for knowledge are simply not priorities. That is why the greatest hope for a true Islamic Renaissance lies with Islamic scholars in the Western countries who are neither afraid of oppressive Muslim regimes nor of the religious bigots who claim a monopoly on Islam. While Western countries forge ahead in every field of knowledge, the Muslim world seems to have given up and relies on being spoon-fed whatever knowledge is passed on by the West. Iqbal called for Muslims to keep their minds open to reinterpretation of the Quran and Islamic law so that they remain relevant in a fast-changing world. He was also strong in his condemnation of the myth-making mullahs who were not equipped to answer the questions of the modern Muslims on contemporary issues. He was apprehensive of the bigotry and intolerance against science, arts, and original thought, and wanted to set up a university for ulama and religious scholars to equip them with the modern tools of knowledge. Iqbal believed that rather than spurning the discoveries of the modern world as un-Islamic, the Muslim world should use the technological and scientific discoveries of the West without subordinating itself to Western values and culture. In one of his verses, he also urged Indian Muslims not to imitate the West, but to be creative while using their own resources. Do not be beholden to Western glass makers with the earth of India. Make a goblet and cup to revisit what is of enduring value in Iqbal's thinking. We need fresh and original minds, capable of combining the aspects of Western democracy that suit us with our indigenous system of local governance. For hundreds of years, villages in the Indian subcontinent were self-contained, running their own schools and councils, their health center and their system of justice, a system known as panchayat. To a certain extent, this still exists in Pakistan in the tribal areas jirga system. We need to revive panchayat and jirga systems to liberate our rural areas from the oppressive feudal culture and empower people at the grassroots. Surely there is much to learn from Western culture. Most of all, its strong institutions, its constant quest for knowledge, and the fierce protection accorded to freedom of expression. This has in turn led to creativity and dynamism. I also feel we can learn from the way democracy has given freedom to most of the Western world, in sharp contrast to the sham democracies we have experienced in Pakistan and other parts of the Muslim world. People are fully aware of their rights, and there is public outcry as soon as any one of them is violated. At times, however, the right of an individual can take precedence over the larger interest of the community, unlike in Eastern societies where the community's interest is paramount. However, the foundations of a just and equitable Islamic society are only to be found in the Quran. Sadly, more than 60 years after its birth, neither Iqbal nor Jinnah would recognize the country Pakistan has become. Economically ruined by a ruling elite, hungry for money and power, it has become the only nuclear-armed Islamic country, yet cannot protect its people from near daily bombings and is one of only 4 countries in the world that have never beaten polio. A succession of military rulers and corrupt civilian governments has been unable to deliver even the most basic services like healthcare and education to the ordinary people in whose name the country was created. Although never quite a failed state, Pakistan has become a failing state. The Quran asks Muslims to follow the middle way, the narrow path that lies between all possible extremes. Only an informed public is capable of making informed choices. And an informed public needs an informed ulama. In the 1960s, a brilliant Pakistani scholar, Dr. Fazlur Rahman, who taught in the US at the University of Chicago, was invited by President Ayub Khan to set up the Central Institute of Islamic Research. Dr. Rahman aimed to recruit the best minds in the country and get them to undertake a study of the Quran in its historical context so that certain verses could not be misused. He felt people were being misled by the preachers who wanted a selective Islam to suit their own interests and quoted isolated verses of the Quran out of context. Sadly, his views clashed with those of the religious traditionalists, and not only was he hounded out of Pakistan, but was one of the causes for the downfall of Ayub Khan. The main difference Islamic Sharia has from Western secular society is in the realm of public morality. This protects our family system, one of Pakistan's greatest strengths. Infidelity is strongly condemned and considered one of the greatest sins, as it is in all great religions. People who believe in God know that while they can deceive their spouse, they cannot deceive the Almighty. An Islamic society tries to protect the sanctity of marriage by creating an environment that affords the least temptation for people to commit infidelity. Secondly, it tries to protect impressionable young people from public immorality. The same concept behind the adults-only film classification. Furthermore, Islam puts huge emphasis on responsibility to the family. According to the Prophet, the best of you is he who is best to his family. And I am the best among you towards my family. Today, millions of Pakistani men and women are toiling away at great personal cost to simply feed their family. This is what binds our society. Despite the grinding poverty and injustice that beset many Pakistanis, it is the structure of the family that provides the net that keeps the social fabric intact. I know of so many people whose extended family members are all pooling resources to feed other relatives, with absolutely no social security net whatsoever. Were it not for our powerful family system, the country would have descended into bloodshed long ago. So, apart from these vital provisions aimed at protecting the family, a true Islamic society would be no different from the democratic welfare states of Europe. Human rights are, after all, at the center of the Quran. The right to life, justice, respect, freedom of speech and movement, privacy, protection from slander and ridicule, a secure place of residence and a means of living are all enshrined in the Quran. Islam gives all the freedom of a secular society. Yet an Islamic state cannot be secular. To understand secularism as it exists in the West today, it is important to remember the evolution of Christianity within the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire became Christian, the state and church had their distinct boundaries. Over the centuries, many other influences have shaped modern-day secularism. But the separation of church and state could not happen in Islam, as it has no concept of a church. As Iqbal stated, Islam was from the very beginning a civil society, having received from the Quran a set of simple legal principles, which, like the 12 tables of the Romans, carried, as experience subsequently proved, great potentialities of expansion and development by interpretation. Elaborating his point, Iqbal said, "This dualism, separation of state and church, does not exist in Islam." He went on to warn that when a state is governed without the moral values that are rooted in religion, then naked materialism is likely to replace it. Exactly the observation made by Mohandas Gandhi when he remarked, "Those who say religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion is." The two greatest institutional tyrannies of all times, the Nazi Reich and the Soviet Union, were godless constructs. Islamic culture is rooted in spirituality, while capitalist culture is rooted in materialism. This is not to say that spirituality in Islam is to the exclusion of wealth accumulation. On the contrary, it is even encouraged, but it is not an end in itself as it is in capitalism. For example, it would be necessary for a humane and truly Islamic society to sacrifice economic growth in order to protect the environment. The welfare of both the current and future generations would take precedence over greater material wealth. True spirituality will always support any movement that is struggling to save our environment from human greed. One of the names of the Quran is Al-Furqan, the criterion, precisely because it was meant to enable humanity to make this distinction. The number of religious fanatics is growing by the day, thanks to the war on terror. As we saw with the insurgency in Swat, the dispossessed with no stake in the system can become vulnerable to crime and militant Islam. It is not hard to see why the idealistic and romantic are driven to take up arms. There are, of course, religious zealots who, through sheer ignorance, have decided to enforce their uninformed version of Islam through the barrel of the gun. They have done tremendous damage to Islam, failing to understand that the religion is a battle for conquering hearts and minds. There are others who have killed fellow Muslims in the name of their sect. These fundamentalists are not only anti-West, but also virulently against the westernized Pakistani elite, whom they contemptuously see as toadies to the West. While the masses in Pakistan are impressed by the tremendous technological progress of the Western world, their understanding of the Western moral value system mainly comes from watching television, and they do not respect what they see. Therefore, they are deeply suspicious of any attempt towards westernization, particularly women's liberation. They don't regard this as women having the right to fulfill their potential, but rather as women having the right to be sexually permissive. Therefore, westernized Pakistanis are considered to have loose morals too. One of the many derogatory things ordinary people say about westernized couples is that he does not get angry and she has no shame. It is because of this attitude that sometimes modernization is resisted because it is perceived to be westernization. People are also therefore wary of foreign NGOs dealing with women. The gulf between the different strata of Pakistani society is so great now that those at the other end of the extreme are called the liberal fanatics. To liberal fanatics, modernization means westernization, and Islam can only impede Pakistan's progress. Lacking a proper understanding of Islam, they see the religion through Western eyes and are convinced that it is a retrogressive, primitive creed of ancient desert folk. Sadly, they are not equipped to hold any dialogue with the religious fanatics because they are not armed with sufficient knowledge of Islam. For them, every solution to Pakistan's problems is imported. Hence, liberal fanatics have variously advocated Marxism, a radical version of women's liberation, market economics, and other Western beliefs. These people only have to study the colonial history of the past 2 centuries to realize that wherever an alien culture was imposed on an indigenous people, it caused mass upheaval, disruption and destruction to their way of life. From the Aborigines of Australia to the Indians of the Americas and most of Africa, the local people fell between 2 stools in the name of modernization. The societies that have been success stories, such as Japan and China, have all used Western knowledge but developed it in the context of their own culture and environment. Pakistani liberal fanatics preach secularism, yet they don't fully understand the evolution of secularism in Europe. Martin Luther's movement was aimed at freeing religion from the stranglehold of the Catholic Church, not at abolishing religion altogether. Unfortunately, our liberal fanatics are bent upon imposing Western secular values on a country where the vast majority's entire way of life is influenced by religion. The liberal fanatics have only one solution, Hitler's final solution. They want the Pakistani army to exterminate the religious fundamentalists. They only have to look at the history of Iran, Algeria, and Egypt to know that whenever fundamentalism is suppressed, it gets violent. These 2 sections of Pakistani society have become further polarized with the war on terror, and each tends to dehumanize the other. If a westernized class started to study Islam, not only would it be able to project the dynamic spirit of Islam, but also help our society fight sectarianism and extremism. They would be able to help the Western world by articulating Islamic concepts correctly. How can the group that is in the best position to project Islam do so when it sees Islam through Western eyes? The most damaging aspect of the gulf between the 2 sections of our society is that it has stopped the evolution of both religion and culture in Pakistan. The elite that consumes most of the country's educational resources is incapable of providing the intellectual leadership needed to move forward, either the religion or the culture. Western education simply does not equip them to do so. There is no confusion about the role of Islam in Pakistan among ordinary people who are comfortable with their Islamic heritage and live by their faith. Only in the minds of the westernized English-speaking elite, the inheritors of British colonial rule, is there a confusion of identity. The secularists in Pakistan, with their scant knowledge of Islam, believe that an Islamic state persecutes religious minorities. They quote the lines on freedom of worship from Jinnah's famous speech to the Constituent Assembly in 1947 to justify their claim that Pakistan was meant to be a secular state that gave equal rights to the minorities. Jinnah, however, was simply highlighting the tolerance that exists in Islam towards non-Muslims when he said, "You are free. You are free to go to your temples, you are free to go to your mosques or to any other place of worship in this state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed that has nothing to do with the business of the state." While Islam and the two-nation theory, the ideology on which the split between Pakistan and India was based, remained the bedrock of Pakistan's foundations, it is clear that religious dogma should not be used to spread prejudice, intolerance, and sectarianism. Unfortunately, though, one of the worst aspects of Muslim religious bigots is that they preach hatred towards minorities or other Islamic sects, taking Quranic verses out of context to justify their actions. They ignore or are ignorant of the fact that the Prophet's life has many examples of tolerance towards other religious groups. There were incidences of both Jewish and Christian delegations being allowed to pray in his mosque. The Prophet's last sermon encapsulates his vision of universal human rights. All of you come from Adam, and Adam is of dust. Indeed, the Arab is not superior to the non-Arab, and the non-Arab is not superior to the Arab. Nor is the fair skin superior to the dark skin, nor the dark skin superior to the fair skin. Superiority comes from piety, and the noblest among you is the most pious. Know that all Muslims are brothers unto one another. You are one brotherhood. And your slaves, see that you feed them with such food as you eat yourselves, and clothe them with the stuff that you wear. If they commit a fault which you are not inclined to forgive, then part with them. For they are the servants of the Lord, and are not to be harshly treated. It is evident that discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, or class is prohibited by the Quran, which also stresses there is no compulsion in religion, Quran 256. In fact, Islam goes further than many religions, actually acknowledging the legitimacy of other faiths. As the religious scholar Karen Armstrong has pointed out, the Quran is almost unique in its positive view of other peoples, other religious traditions. There is nothing like Quranic pluralism in either the Torah or the Gospel. The Quran declares that every people on the face of the earth has received a divine revelation. She has slammed the West's medieval conviction about the inherent intolerance of Islam, arguing that extremism today stems from intractable political problems: oil, Palestine, the occupation of Muslim lands, the prevalence of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, and the West's perceived double standards, and not to an ingrained religious imperative. Through hundreds of years of Islamic history, non-Muslims played a significant role in Muslim communities. The Rajputs in Mughal India, Christians and Jews in Muslim Spain, and the Greek Orthodox and Jews in the Ottoman Empire. The tolerance shown to non-Muslims was unknown to religious minorities in the Europe of the Middle Ages. Yet in the West, Islam is perceived as a religion that encourages aggression towards others. Even if some try to use Islam to justify violence, the Quran and the Hadith, or sayings of the Prophet, do not sanction this behavior. The Quran, in no uncertain terms, prohibits the desecration of houses of worship, suicide, and murder. According to journalist and historian Paul Johnson, 150 million people were killed by state violence in the 20th century. Muslim countries had an insignificant share in this slaughter, never witnessed before in the history of humanity. The two greatest butchers of the 20th century were born Christians. Hitler was born and brought up a Roman Catholic, and Stalin was once a Russian Orthodox apprentice monk. It is as ridiculous to blame Christianity for their deeds as it is to blame Islam for any inhuman behavior by a Muslim. Jinnah's speech to the country's economists at the State Bank on 1 July 1948 underlined the fact that Islamic principles today are as applicable to life as they were 1,300 years ago. He said, Islam and its idealism have taught democracy. Islam has taught equality, justice, and fair play to everybody. What reason is there for anyone to fear democracy, equality, freedom on the highest standard of integrity and on the basis of fair play and justice for everybody? This would be in line with Iqbal's spiritual democracy, where people would be free from oppression and where no policies could be made that did not make people the main focus. This is what is meant when Allah says in the Quran to hold on to the rope of the people. I am convinced that Pakistan has lost its way because there has been no serious attempt to translate this vision into practice. The Quran lays great emphasis on both justice and education. Yet in both these areas, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan has sorely failed. Our failure in each of these areas has fed into the other. Our education system breeds injustice. Our unjust society neglects education for the masses. At the core of an Islamic state is the principle of justice. That is why I named my party Tehreek-e-Insaf, Movement for Justice. The Quran says, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor." Quran 2, 135. Being fair and just was considered one of the greatest virtues in the religion. Every human being was supposed to be equal in front of the law. This was a revolutionary concept in the Prophet's day because the administration of laws without discrimination on grounds of race, color, and language was not known before the advent of Islam. Initially envisaged by Iqbal and Jinnah as a democratic country in which people, regardless of race, tribe, religion, or sect, would live in peace and harmony free from exploitation and discrimination, Pakistan is now a deeply divided nation. The concentration of power at the center has negated the spirit of federalism with Pashtuns, Baluchis, Sindhis, Kashmiris, and Muhajirs. Resentful of Punjabi hegemony, a sense of deprivation and marginalization right from the country's beginning led to the loss of East Pakistan and prevented the formation of a national identity strong enough to bind our new nation together. Meanwhile, the elite has looted the country's riches and squandered its resources, and the poor have lived in deprivation and hardship. The majority of the country is deprived of access to education, healthcare, and a free and efficient judicial system. Two of the most corrupt government departments are the police and lower judiciary. The Tile case against Jemima was an example of how our judiciary is unable to protect citizens from state tyranny. And as my time in detention taught me, most of the inmates of our dirty, overcrowded, underfunded jails are poor people who did not have the means to buy themselves a fair trial. Yet, there was no concept of detention in the Islamic justice system except in rare cases. The rich can buy themselves out of any legal trouble. In the rural areas, poor people are harassed in every way. Therefore, the poor vote not for the man who is clean and honest, but for the one who can protect them from the powerful. The party in power has the entire state machinery at its disposal to try and eliminate the opposition. Hence, without an independent judiciary, we will never have real democracy. The great ideal where safeguards in the law were meant to protect the innocent has been perverted in Pakistan to protect powerful criminals. Whenever there is talk of reform, we are told that the government has no money either to give adequate salaries or modernize the two departments. We do not have the resources to pay the judges adequately or build more courts to cater for our expanding population. I feel that in rural areas at least, one thing that would help would be a return of the village councils, panchayats, and jirgas that dispensed justice so successfully to the people of the subcontinent for centuries. Let the village elders, selected through village consensus, adjudicate petty crime and land disputes and award punishments in the traditional way, with the victim compensated rather than the culprit jailed. Pakistan's feudal system has cursed us with a grossly unfair social system in parts of the country. There are horrendous stories of exploitation especially of women. In the feudal areas, the powerful treat the women from poor families as their property, and their menfolk are too powerless to do anything about it. During the 2010 floods, there were reports that big landlords in South Punjab and Sindh diverted the flood waters and breached embankments in order to save their own land, immune to the damage and suffering. This caused many ordinary people. The attitude of the feudal and other powerful groups that they are above the law fuels corruption. This is one of the reasons Pakistan has such an enormous rich-poor divide. While our elite have private jets, security cavalcades, and numerous apartments and mansions in swanky locations around the globe, more than half the country suffers from what the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, calls multi-dimensional deprivations, lack of access to proper education, health facilities, and a decent standard of living. Instead of following the example of the Holy Prophet and his initial successors, all of whom lived with simplicity, Pakistani politicians have always wanted to set themselves up like Mughal emperors. In contrast, in the UK, the tone is set by the simplicity of the Prime Minister's Downing Street residence. Why should Pakistan's politicians be allowed to stash so many of their assets abroad, especially when they have no known source of income outside the country? What kind of leader needs an insurance policy like that? I am the only political leader to have all my assets declared in my own name and all of them in Pakistan. And most of my earnings came from playing professional cricket abroad. People will pay taxes if they felt their hard-earned money was not being wasted on the shamelessly luxurious lifestyles of our rulers or siphoned off out of the country. Crooks like this across developing countries loot and plunder while in power and prepare for their retirement in Western cities and resorts with bulging Swiss bank accounts. There should no bank secrecy laws for those third world politicians, bureaucrats, and generals who are prosecuted on corruption charges. And they should be immediately extradited to the country they have plundered. This would be the greatest gift of the West to the developing world. This would help the impoverished masses much more than either aid or loans. Our economy is filled with injustices too. First, our ruling elite has been totally inhuman and immoral in colluding with the IMF, crushing the poor to service our debts. In each budget, the voiceless majority is burdened with indirect taxes, which hit the poor disproportionately. Of course, it would be far too much to ask the rich to pay direct taxes, so instead we penalize the poor. When there is no reaction from them, emboldened, the government increases their load each year. The people were neither consulted when the loans were taken, nor do they know how the loans were spent. There has never been an audit of where the loans disappeared to. Between 2008 and 2011, our debt has doubled from 5 trillion rupees to 10 trillion, from US $59 billion to US $120 billion. About 65% of all tax collected goes into debt repayment. Pakistan spends more than 60% of its national budget each year on defense and servicing its debt, while 1.5% goes on education and only 0.5% on health. In addition, the country has lost about 256 billion rupees in loans to the rich and powerful that have been written off. Meanwhile, crippling inflation, aggravated by Islamabad's habit of borrowing from its own state bank, and rising utility and fuel bills have meant that the salaried class cannot survive without taking bribes. As corruption in the bureaucracy rises, the life of the citizens becomes more and more unbearable, and policy implementation by the government becomes yet more difficult with such a corrupt civil service. This is not just about economics, but about the nation's self-esteem. How can Pakistanis ever be encouraged to achieve their potential while we remain a cowed nation that cannot operate without international aid? In cricket, I discovered a team that has self-esteem and belief in itself will play way beyond its capabilities and can even thrash a more talented team. The tragedy of Pakistan is that we have become accustomed to these crutches from the US and multilateral and bilateral lenders. Not only has it destroyed our self-belief, but we have never learned to live within our means, and our corrupt and incompetent ruling elite are bailed out time and time again. Pakistan's $167 billion economy was hit badly by the 2010 floods, the worst in its history. The Asian Development Bank and World Bank put the damage at about $10 billion, as usual. Rather than relying on the skills and resilience of its own people, the government, as it did after the 2005 earthquake, immediately turned to the rest of the world with its begging bowl. The fact that the international community was reluctant to donate to flood relief in 2010, but that somehow the country has soldiered on, demonstrates that Pakistan's recovery was in the end mainly due to the hard work, perseverance, and generosity of the Pakistani people. For example, in 2010, I headed a campaign to raise funds for the flood victims, and in 1 month collected 2 billion rupees. Everyone I knew contributed for the flood victims. Such was the spirit amongst the people. By restoring the trust of the people in public institutions, we can harness their potential and mobilize them for a better tomorrow. In the meantime, our rich agricultural land, our enormous mineral wealth, consisting of billions of dollars of copper and gold reserves, 10 different types of marble, highest quality granite, and emerald deposits in Swat, newfound gas reserves in Kohat, our 6 million overseas community, and our huge youthful population go to waste. One of the often mentioned ironies of Pakistan is that it was founded as a homeland for the subcontinent's Muslims. Yet every year, thousands of Pakistanis go abroad in a bid to build a better life. The greatest asset of a nation is its people. But here, the rich get US green cards or Canadian passports, and the poor go to the Gulf to toil on construction sites. Every year, my cancer hospital loses about a third of its nurses to the Gulf countries. We cannot hope to compete with the salaries they are offered there. Yet, how can we harness our country's potential when we have one of the worst education systems in the world? The sad thing is the British, when they departed, had left behind quality universities. When I was growing up, students from the Middle East and much further afield used to come and study at our universities. Princes from Malaysia would come and study alongside us at HSN College. Unfortunately, successive governments have allowed our education system to decline. Many analysts point to the potentially destabilizing factor of millions of young, uneducated, unemployable people in a country of ever-decreasing resources. Half of Pakistan is under 20, and 2/3 of its population is below the age of 30. The population has trebled in less than half a century. It is forecast to grow by around 85 million in 20 years, which, as a report on the youth of Pakistan, commissioned by the British Council, points out, is roughly the equivalent of 5 cities the size of Karachi. We have a small window of time to turn what could be Pakistan's downfall into its redemption. An army of disenfranchised and angry people competing for dwindling resources could instead be an energetic labor force and a strong domestic market of potential consumers. But Pakistan has spent less of its resources on its education than many poorer countries. Only half of its children go to primary school, while a quarter attend secondary school, and a mere 5% receive higher education. Not only has Pakistan consistently failed to invest enough money in education, but it failed right at the outset by not integrating the education system after independence. There are effectively 3 types of education in our country: private English medium, Urdu medium schools, and madrasas. Each of these operates in entirely different ways and produces an entirely different student. While the top-level English medium schools are maintaining their standards by linking their syllabus to English or American curricula, the Urdu medium schooling system has collapsed after decades of being starved of government attention and funds. No longer can the Urdu schools produce students that can compete with those from the English ones. Our best intellectuals until the 70s came from the government schools. Then there are the madrasas. Some of these, it has to be said, do provide a quality education and get excellent results, drawing children from the middle classes whose parents want their children to have a solid religious base. However, they mainly produce students trained to work in madrasas or mosques, but ignorant of the modern world, sidelined from the mainstream economy, and susceptible to the kind of ideology that promotes sectarianism. Poor parents often send their children to madrasas because not only is the education free, but often board and lodging are provided. With the collapse of the state education system, private schools have become a booming business. All the country's rich and powerful send their children to private English medium schools. But even in rural areas, poor families are dedicating a large portion of their income to educating their children. This demonstrates that many parents, whatever their economic background, fully understand the importance of education. Despite various reports and white papers over the years which have recommended implementing one school system throughout the country, this was never allowed to happen, partly because the elite wanted to maintain the privileged position in society that this unfair system gave them. The nationalization of the education sector in the 1970s is also partly to blame for the dire situation. Even Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani has admitted that the state seizure of Pakistan schools by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's PPP government in 1972 was wrong, making teachers, public servants, allowed politics, and the corruption that inevitably seems to go with it in Pakistan to seep into the teaching profession. Teachers no longer needed to be loyal to a school because the school itself no longer had the power to fire and hire staff. Teachers with political connections could get themselves transferred to a better posting if they wanted to. Placing teachers became a system of patronage, with politicians rewarding supporters with teaching jobs regardless of their qualifications. All over Pakistan, there is the phenomenon of ghost schools, where teachers collect their wages but fail to turn up. Sabia Mansoor, Dean of Pakistan's Beacon House National University and a former fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., has written about how it all went wrong. Bhutto's nationalization of schools created a bureaucratic behemoth. The lumbering giant grew larger and presented more opportunities for corruption in the decades that followed. Today, Pakistan has one of the highest public sector non-teaching to teaching staff ratios in the world. State control also meant that the character of schools would change with the character of the regime in power. This educational crisis is one of the reasons I founded Namal University in Mianwali. It is Pakistan's only private sector university in a rural area. I first had the idea for it because I was dismayed at the effects of unemployment in my constituency. Some villages had a real problem because jobless young men had turned to drugs and crime. So I decided I would set up a technical college. About the same time, the UK's University of Bradford offered me the position of Chancellor. So I thought this was a great opportunity to leverage that and collaborate with them on a Pakistani university. When I met the locals to discuss the idea, they were so generous in offering their land that my plans expanded. Why just have one small college? I wanted a green and self-sustainable knowledge city, a series of academic institutions, and Oxford of Pakistan. The first construction phase is complete, and the first batch of students started in 2007 and will be graduating with a University of Bradford degree in 2012. There is such a skills shortage in the area, they will be immediately employable. Eventually, at this beautiful site next to Namal Lake, I envisage a technology park and commercial areas. In the mountains behind the college, there is a resort built by the British, where I would love to build a summer retreat for the students. The only people to have opposed the project were the local politicians who tried to create as many hurdles as possible. As soon as I presented the plan, the government started building a college 10 kilometers away. Despite spending 3 times more on it than I have on Namal University, it is still a shell. The political elite have no interest in providing education for the masses or changing the status quo. Yet this 3-tier system has had far-reaching repercussions for our society, widening the gap between the small but affluent westernized elite and the masses, and feeding fundamentalism. If anyone read the English newspapers and compared the contents with those of the mass Urdu newspapers, it would seem that they belong to 2 different countries. Every day there is some article in an English paper ridiculing or criticizing some local custom. Yet it makes no difference to the masses because only a small percentage of the population reads them. Most of the students from the top English medium schools become aliens in their own country and struggle to communicate with the Pakistani masses. When we hired graduates from the top business college in Lahore for the cancer hospital's marketing department, I found they had problems dealing with our main donors. The trading community in Lahore, while the traders could barely speak Urdu, their native tongue being Punjabi, our marketing team would converse with them in broken Urdu with plenty of English words thrown in. It really was a pathetic sight because our top business school had prepared these graduates for jobs either in multinationals or abroad. On the other hand, students coming out of Urdu medium schools and madrasas have little understanding of Western culture and resent the elite. Some have been educated to condemn everything Western as un-Islamic. As much of the Middle East struggles to find its way in the next chapter of decolonialization, breaking free from the dictators that have held power since independence, Pakistan too stands poised for change. Like the Middle East, it lies between the status quo, a small elite hogging the resources, and the anti-status quo, a younger generation that desires a participatory democracy. In many ways, Pakistan has many advantages. While it has suffered more than 3 decades of dictatorship, it also has experience dealing with the growing pains of a newly democratic nation. It has political parties with decades of experience, a largely free media, and the space for dissent that was long denied many other Muslim countries. The people's creativity and initiative have not been suppressed by a police state or the personality cult of any omnipotent dictator. There is still a healthy irreverence towards the powerful. However, Pakistan does have to make sense of the many and sometimes conflicting ideologies that have been thrown at it. It does have to make peace with the complexities of its ethnic mix and the tensions inherent in its geographical and cultural location at the crossroads between South and Central Asia and the Middle East. That location should, of course, be an economic advantage rather than a source of never-ending geopolitical troubles. I can see that young people are civic-minded, if deeply disillusioned with Pakistani politics and national institutions like the police. The participation of thousands of young people in the lawyers' movement that restored the Chief Justice of Pakistan in the face of formidable opposition in 2010 preceded the rights movement in the Middle East. Though the anti-status quo wave known as the lawyers' movement for genuine democracy was hijacked, it remains simmering beneath the surface. I am convinced the moment the next elections are announced, a soft revolution will explode on our political horizon and sweep away the corrupt status quo from Pakistan once and for all.